I'm Jennifer Isabella.
And I'm Melissa Parrish.
Your co-host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, we're joined by VP and Principal Analyst David Truog to discuss how to design and build better chatbots. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I feel like when chatbots came onto the scene, it's like, oh, they're going to solve every possible problem tech-wise on my website, my mobile app, what have you. But let's just maybe level set. Where are chatbots playing today? What are the use cases that we'll be sort of discussing and maybe unpacking today in today's conversation?
Yeah, it's true. There was a lot of excitement initially, and you can understand that because, we're human beings. We need to communicate to get something done. And that communication, if it relies on human natural language, as opposed to having to click through a website or some other method of interacting with computers, well, wow, how appealing is that? That sounds wonderful, right? If it works. And the problem is that conversational AI and the rest of the technology that underlies chatbots is largely in its infancy. And so it's been disappointing in a lot of cases. Those specific cases, the use cases for chatbots, have fallen into, I'd say, two broad categories. One is companies trying to improve the customer experience, or I'd rather say the user experience to include employees, because chatbots also apply there, improving UX, or lowering costs, right? So the motivation for improving the customer experience, of course, is that in the case of customers, you're generating more revenue, which is attractive to any business. In a lot of situations, though, companies are going to chatbots because they want to reduce costs, specifically the cost of customer service and of staffing customer service contact centers with humans who are either taking phone calls or engaging in what's called live chat, which just means human to human chat. And they'd like to be able to replace that with a chat bot, since that's much more affordable. At least over time, the thought is that it is more affordable. That's the most common use case.
So just yesterday, I was speaking with another analyst who talks about chatbots, and they said that they had a question from a client, which was, "Can you separate for me what kind of chatbot is good and what kind of chatbot sucks?" And I jokingly said, "All of them, they all suck," which is not true. I was obviously being hyperbolic, but I wonder if you could separate out for us, David, what's the problem? How come chatbots haven't lived up to the hype? How come you both just laughed when I talked about how badly chatbots have been working for us?
Well, I think it's a matter of expectations, right? Because I completely agree with you. They're terrible if you expect a lot from them. Some of them are okay or even pretty good if you have low expectations. And a big part of the problem is just right up front, a lot of chatbots will say, "How can I help you?" Which sounds great, right? You can see why somebody would program them to do that, because that's what a friendly store clerk would say, for example, or a customer service agent. The problem is it sets the expectation that the chatbot can do a lot more than it really can today, at least. And therefore, you start happy, and then it's all downhill from there because the chatbot starts saying, "I don't understand what you mean. Could you repeat that?" And eventually it might say, "I can help you with the following three things," which it should have said in the first place, right? If it had said that right up front, then you can actually be helpful with customers by setting their expectations to something that corresponds with reality. And there are companies doing that and doing subtle but very powerful things. For example, using a little graphical representation of the bot that deliberately looks kind of like a comic book character that's kind of simple. And you want to communicate that your chatbot is a simpleton. Or as one of my interviewees put it when I was doing research for a series of reports on this topic of chatbot design, chatbots are island geniuses. They're simpletons, right? And the idea of island genius is really smart about a very small area. And if you try to go beyond that, they can't do it. So it's very important to recognize the limited capabilities and be upfront about that, so that you don't disappoint people by setting expectations way too high.
it's very often I see chatbots in the context of retailer e-commerce experiences where it's like, oh, well, I need help with this order. Like, oh, well, I can't look up that order because you have to sign in and then you have to click this and you have to, well, then actually you can't help me. And if they had just
Right.
said at the beginning, I can help you with, our return policy and, this thing and that thing, my expectations would have been much lower.
Yes, exactly. And that's why, so I think there are two dimensions to what you're saying there. One is that chatbots for now and for the foreseeable future are going to have to remain simple. You're going to have to keep your ambitions modest. But even within that, there's sort of another growth or evolution curve, which is that in deploying your own chatbot, if you own, for example, if you control a retail website, you want to start with a very modest chatbot and iterate and make it better and better. Again, it's not going to be great anytime soon. It just isn't. But start with something modest that can be helpful. One of my interviews for this research, in fact, is a retailer. It was the CIO of PacSun, and she was talking about how PacSun rolled out their chatbot during the early stages of the pandemic when they were just flooded with online orders that they had not prepared for, obviously, like most businesses. And they had to roll out that technology very quickly. And they did it initially for very simple things. If you think about it, the simplest kind of request for a chatbot would be informational, not transactional. In other words, tell me something like, what's your return policy? Well, that's easy, right? Because you just need to understand roughly those words and then look up some static text and spit it back. That's it. Whereas if you say, I'd like to modify the order I placed yesterday evening, whoa, that's more complex. You need to not only understand what that means, but look up an order and then be able to make modifications in a database, much more complex. So it would not make sense to tackle that first. First, you want to tackle those static informational requests.
Are you seeing like, we as consumers are kind of getting burned by chatbots with our high expectations, but I'm assuming on the flip side, are you seeing, clients being like, this is going to solve or reduce, costs tremendously and sort of going into with too high of expectations and assumptions of how it's going to impact overhead or their business? Because I imagine actually in the example that Melissa just provided, now you have a really frustrated customer on your hands who will be likely a little bit more upset going into a customer service call, which will maybe be longer than it initially needed to be. I mean, the sort of like domino effect of bad technology, in this case, a chatbot, could have ripple effects. And then obviously, from a client perspective, feeling a little burned on
Yes.
investing there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good insight, Jen. In fact, that domino effect happens a lot, where uh, the the customer service agent who ends up taking the call is dealing with somebody who's much more stressed because the chatbot was not able to solve their problem. Um, and of course the chatbot is able to solve some of the problems, so the agent is getting the subset of customers who already have more complex problems, right? So you're going to have to deal with more complexity and some emotional stress coming in that's become kind of bottled up because it wouldn't have happened if they'd gotten directly to a human. So what does that mean for the pressure on your contact center staff, even on your hiring and training practices? Do you need to train them to have better just emotional intelligence for dealing with those situations? So those are kind of the risks. But you're right that up front, because of the promise of chatbots, there's a lot of excitement about rolling them out. Um, and often, unfortunately, because of that, there's a lot of hurry. And the mistake that a lot of the folks I interviewed about this and about their experience rolling out chatbots, what they described is a lot of companies make the mistake of thinking of it purely as an IT project. Because yes, there is a lot of technology involved, just assigning it to a dev team and saying, go for it. And unfortunately, what is missing in that picture is experience design. Um, Understanding the humans who are going to be using the chatbot and understanding the processes and techniques that designers are able to use to go from the research that's required to understand the needs of users to iterating through prototypes of the chatbot, rolling it out, tuning it over time. So I'm not saying IT is not involved, of course, it's hugely important, but the two are complementary. and need to go together. And that came up again and again in my interviews, the need for both of those things. And the reason, sometimes I think there's just ignorance, like, well, it's just technology, so let's assign it to a dev team. Sometimes, though, I think there is a realization that, well, design would be nice to involve, but we just don't have time. We have to get this chatbot out there quickly. Unfortunately, that backfires because then you roll out the chatbot, and not only does it underperform, but it actually backfires because your customers get angry or unhappy, and it makes the situation worse instead of making it better, which is why it's really, really important to have design involved upfront.
I actually think we should unpack that a little bit because I think when we say experience design, it's so easy to get stuck in the frame of mind that it is how uh, buttons and drop downs and navigation work on a
Hmm.
screen. Uh, Websites, sure, mobile websites, or some sort of uh, hands-on keyboard experience. When really now that the way consumers are interacting with technology is changing so vastly, and human computer interaction is taking on these different modalities, voice and whatnot. Experience design is still required. It's just a little bit different because it's not about is it a radio button or multiple choice kind of scenario. Can you tell us a little bit more for the non-experts out there? What kinds of elements of experience design apply when we're not talking about something visual or tactical?
Yes, and that's a really good point. And I think there are kind of two dimensions to what you're describing there, Melissa. One is that um, when you're dealing with a modality that is non-visual, so if your chatbot is text, there's not a lot of visuals, right? It's just a box that you're typing in, and there are maybe bubbles going back and forth containing text. Or if it's a voice-based chatbot, there's even less, right? It may just be a hardware device with no visuals, basically. Um, and so people who have a certain understanding of design that is just about the surface might say, well, why do you need a designer? In the case of voice, there is no design except maybe some industrial design for the smart speaker that the voice assistant is based in, if that's what they're imagining. And for a chatbot that's on a website in a little box at the bottom right of the browser, what is there to design? A square, choosing the color and the font of the bubbles going back and forth. That's not much to that, right? Um, but the reality is that, first of all, design goes deeper than that and always has, even before we had these modalities. It's not just about the surface. It's about the interaction design. It's about the understanding the information architecture, the mental models of the user, and how those map to the architecture of the data that underlies the system. So all of that is part of design and user experience. And is intimately tied, of course, to the development process of the software that underlies these systems. The second dimension is what you were alluding to in talking about new modalities. That it's true that these are because you're dealing with text and voice, but that fundamentally are about human language. There's a new element that did not appear in designing those traditional graphical user interfaces, and in fact, an entirely new discipline has emerged around it called conversation design. And conversation designer is now a job title. If you do some Googling, you'll find a bunch of job listings, more and more companies looking for conversation designers because there's a recognition that understanding sort of the flow of a dialogue, the back and forth, that's a thing. Some companies made the mistake early on of thinking like, well, what does a chatbot do? All right, questions and answers. Ooh, we have an FAQ on our website, frequently asked questions, some questions and some answers. So what we'll do is we'll just set up the chatbot to recognize those questions, and then it could just pump out those answers that we've already written. Well, that's not a conversation. That's not how humans interact, right? First of all, people are going to ask the questions in many different ways, not necessarily the way you had them in the FAQ. Secondly, pumping out answers that are long chunks of static text that you've just kind of written in advance that are based on assumptions about what people want to know is not a recipe for success. I don't want to shoot that down as useless. It can be a useful starting point, but just a seed for developing your system, for maybe thinking about like, well, okay, these are some things that we've assumed uh, our users would want to know, whether customers or employees. And these are the things that we believe are helpful answers, but we probably need to break them up a little bit. We need to introduce the notion of conversational turns of back and forth. Um, a chatbot does not engage in a speech, right? Or giving a 45-minute presentation, if you think about it that way, in a voice context. Or, this back and forth that I'm having with you is sort of a conversation, but because it's an interview, there's a little bit of an asymmetry. I'm doing more of the talking. That's sort of expected, although I'm probably being a little long-winded right now. But still, there's some back and forth, right? And with a chatbot, it's the same thing. You would want to equip your chatbot to give an answer, but then leave the possibilities open for where the user might want to go next. Similarly, users tend to not say everything right up front. Like, kind of like if you go into a store, you might say, I want to buy 3 shirts. You don't immediately say 3 shirts in size large in the following 3 colors, bang, bang, bang. That's not how people speak. So the store clerk would say, oh, what's your size? Well, here are some colors we have. Do those sound interesting? Would you like others? And you can imagine a similar kind of scenario for customer service. My modem is broken, or my vacuum cleaner is making a weird noise. Oh, what model of vacuum cleaner? When did it start? Right? Not everything shows up right up front. So the bot needs to be able to go back and forth and do what, in the lingo is called identifying the intent. In other words, what is the desired action behind the utterance, the thing the person said? And there are many possible ways of saying the thing that would map to a single intent. And then within that intent, there are what are known as slots or parameters or variables, which would be, for example, okay, you have a problem with your vacuum cleaner, which model? And there are 7 different models. And so you need to identify that the chatbot needs to know. So it needs to be able to come back and ask that question. So that dialogue, that back and forth, is a whole art and science. And I deliberately say art and science because those 2 elements are part of it. They're extremely important technical elements. And then, for the conversation design aspect of it that I'm sort of for shorthand calling art. That's why companies are hiring people who have skills in linguistics, in writing dialogue, either for novels or even better for plays, theater people, Melissa, like you, and who understand
Finally, I love it.
exactly the super practical application and skill here, and who understand also kind of the anthropological dimension of how do people actually speak.
That sounds amazing, David, what you just described. Are there some, clients who have this in practice today in their chatbot, or I don't know, maybe their team members have linguistic backgrounds, or how this sort of has come to life in current experiences?
Yes, there are a lot of companies that either have those people on staff or work with consultancies or agencies that have some of those people. Um, they're hard to get, and they're commanding a pretty high price these days. Also, I found through my research. So, one of the companies I interviewed on this topic is, in fact, an agency that did an app for Planned Parenthood, which I think illustrates this quite well on several fascinating levels. So, the app that Planned Parenthood, or rather the need that Planned Parenthood wanted to address up front, was to help teenagers specifically get answers to their questions about sexual health. And they didn't know that it was going to be a chatbot up front. They partnered with this consultancy, this agency. Its name is Work and Co. To understand what might be the best way to do it. And first of all, they identified chat as a modality that teenagers would appreciate, as opposed to using search through a knowledge base on a website or something, or calling a hotline to get answers. That a chatbot would be appealing, and it's very interesting here because there's actually a benefit to dealing with anonymous bot, because teenagers are asking questions that are maybe a little bit socially taboo, that they might be reluctant to open up to an adult about directly in some cases. And so it's actually very comforting to deal with a bot. It's the opposite. In other words, it's not a compromise, right? Sometimes we think of chatbots as like, well, it'd be better for a human, but to save money, we'll use a bot. Well, it's actually better in this case. But then one of the things they had to do is think, all right, it's good to have the sort of the clinicalness of the bot and that's actually not a human. On the other hand, the way adolescents are going to ask these questions, it's not going to be clinical language. So what is the language that adolescents use now? Because of course it changes about these topics. And so they had to do some anthropological research and hang out with some teenagers and ask them questions and speak with them to understand the lingo, the language, and the way they might say these things, because the bot had to be able to speak like them, understand them, in order to be able to respond effectively. And you can translate that to many other domains, of course. One of my interviewees is a provider of bots for traders, professional traders, and brokers. And in that case, there's a very specialized language that they use, of course, that none of the three of us would understand because it's technical language used in the finance industry, or at least I would not. I shouldn't. Either of you might, but not me.
Gosh, no.
And so their bot has very specific expertise domains. Like within finance, there are sort of very specialized domains, and they have bots that specialize in each of those. And that is sort of, that's very different than speaking to teenagers about their sexual health questions. But there's just as much a specialized lingo. And this sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that having a very specific scope is super important. And that concretely means identifying the list of intents. Scope may seem a little abstract. Well, it's like, okay, what are the 10 intents or 100 intents maybe that your bot is going to be able to address? Make that list. Now, figure out the 10,000 ways people might say those 100 things. Because in natural language, it's not just they clicked this menu, then they went to this screen, right? There are 1,000 different ways of saying that. It's one of the fundamentals of linguistics, is the infinite generative capability of language, which used to seem like sort of an abstraction. Well, here it's really impacting businesses and websites and apps very concretely. And so recognizing which utterance, which intent the utterance maps to, and then going from the utterance to actually doing something useful, that set of utterances and what the things are that it can do, that's the scope very concretely.
So one of the things that you just mentioned, David, that we haven't really talked about at all so far is this idea that the chatbot was not just a convenient tool or an efficient tool, but it was the right one for what Planned Parenthood was trying to accomplish. It reminds me of many years ago when I was a young analyst and you were my RD, and I was
I remember
covering
that.
um, communities, social media and communities. Um, I ran across this use case for communities that went poorly because it was a community set up to discuss different types of cancer. And what the provider, the healthcare provider, had discovered was that there's some kinds of cancer that people want to create a community around. They want to talk about to other people who are dealing with skin cancer or breast cancer or other kinds of commonly discussed cancers. But there are other kinds. It is still, it's taboo. It feels weird. You want to get answers to questions. You want to know what people's experiences have been, but you don't necessarily want to like join a community and identify yourself as having this disease. I mention all of that because chatbots were not a thing back then. Now I can see that being an incredible use case for that kind of community. And I wonder if you have other ideas of the kinds of places where chatbots will not just be in the future when they're better, will not just be more efficient or cool, but actually the right tool. Are there ways you can think of that chatbots will evolve to be the modality of choice?
I think that The most interesting way they will become the modality of choice is when botness is more attractive than humanness. In other words, there is this, there are times when you want your bot to feel as human as possible, but it's a mistake to think that that's always a goal. So one of the things that companies do, for example, for a lot of chatbots, which may sound silly when you hear it, but it actually makes a difference, is have a deliberate delay. Because often the chatbot, if the intent you expressed is something it can address, it knows the answer instantly, right, in microseconds. But if it answers that fast, humans are a little weirded out. Like that's strange, right? Because a human, whether it's live chat, meaning human to human text chat, or a voice conversation, would take it maybe a second or at least a half a second, but even that is detectable, right? As like, okay, I'm speaking with a human. Whereas it feels a little machine-like and robotic if the bot responds instantly. However, in some circumstances, that might be entirely fine, and the botness is a virtue. It's an attribute. It's something that you want to promote. Um, because of the privacy situations that I described a moment ago. But longer term, I think the very interesting direction this is going is that what chatbots do and what search does are actually very closely related. They're not the same, but there's a lot of overlap. So if you think about the way you search for things, you type some words into a search bar. Some people are kind of used to thinking in terms of keywords because they speculate at least about what the algorithm is doing. Other people write well punctuated questions with a question mark at the end, and then there's a whole range in between. Well, there's kind of the psychology of asking a question, which you might think about with a bot as well. And people have similar behaviors with bots. Some people ask a question, other people treat it just like search. Even the technology behind it, depending on which vendor you're dealing with, there are differences. Some of them are actually keyword based. There is no AI. And some of them use natural language processing and are quite sophisticated, or a mix between the two. So the reason I say all this is sort of as context for the fact that ultimately I believe they're going to converge. There will not be a difference between chat bots and search bars. And secondly, the chat experience will, instead of being, say, like a box at the lower right of the browser, or a feature you go to in your app, it will be ubiquitous in the experience. So, for example, you know how when you're filling out a form on the web, if you hesitate for a moment with your mouse near one of the fields, you might get a little tiny box with some text and explanatory text that pops up. This is called a tooltip, a bit of a strange name, but or sometimes hover text. Well, what if instead of that being static text, instead or in addition contained a little chat box where you could start asking questions about what this field is for or how you should answer it, or what a if it's, say, asking for information from your tax return, and you could ask for which page, which box, and more specifics, or can I provide this instead, or maybe ask, well, why do you need this information? All kinds of things that are not possible to do right now. Because what do you have to do right now? You usually have to go to some other page, find an FAQ or a knowledge base, or call somebody up. So those are situations where the bot is the right answer, right? There's no way a human would ever be able to address those tiny cases. And essentially, you want an integrated search engine and conversational AI that is present in context with the task that you're doing and at the place that you're doing it right then and right there.
Is that 5 years from now? 10 years from now? Because I like what you're saying. So I'd like to experience this in my lifetime at least.
For this to truly happen in the way I described, with convergence of search and conversational AI, I'm going to say 10, and I'll be delighted if it's 5. It'll be happening sooner in attempts, but they'll be failing. They'll be falling all over
Sure.
themselves. But it'll be the beginnings of it. But I haven't seen it yet. That's anywhere, which is interesting to me. But I think it's got to be where we're headed. Now, conversely, there are other situations where you absolutely would not want to have a chatbot, or it might at least be inadvisable. And I can give you a couple of examples from some of the interviews I did. One was from a conversation with Ibrahim Khoury at Alight Solutions, which provides HR solutions, among other things, and broader business process outsourcing solutions. And what Ibrahim described to me is their chatbot solutions for their clients will deliberately identify a situation where, say, if an employee, like I said, is about HR, right? So if an employee is asking a question about benefits and happens to mention that the question has to do with a death in the family, they immediately take that as a signal that this is inappropriate for chatbot. Like, get this person to a human ASAP, because chatbots say goofy things sometimes, and when somebody is talking about a death in their family, that would be the worst time to have a goofy chatbot interaction. So transfer to human. Another one of my interviewees pointed out that let's say you're a financial services company, and you've deployed a chatbot that is, post login, so you know who you're dealing with, you know this client, and based on information about them, including, for example, their net worth, you might identify them as a client whose customer lifetime value is very high, and you would like to give them kind of the VIP kid glove treatment. And that also might be a moment when you'd like to transfer them to a human ASAP if you believe that for what they're trying to do, a human is going to be able to address those needs better.
So, David, we obviously had a deep conversation about chatbots, and we did highlight some really great use cases and experiences, but we sort of ragged on them a little bit throughout this conversation as well. So, can you share your thoughts about the future of chatbots and where they're going and how you see those experiences developing?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, we have been ragging on them, and for good reason. They have a bad reputation, but it's well deserved. At the same time, I'm really bullish about the long term. I mean, this is really exciting, I think, for humans to be able to interact with technology using a more human modality, speaking, right? The way we speak to each other or write to each other. We don't have to interact with each other by selecting from menus on nav bars. That would make human interaction very frustrating. So that's a wonderful promise. I think we just have to recognize that it's very early days. It's very early days in terms of the technology, but also in terms of customers' comfort with the technology. The way companies, and I mean both classes of customers, the users, and also the companies that are deploying these. When I interviewed the team at Google, for example, for this research, it's very interesting because they are developers of Dialogflow, one of the leaders in the AI for chatbots. But they actually told me they recommended that companies not start with the AI, start with a purely rules-based deterministic chatbot, and move on to using natural language processing later on. In other words, they're not saying don't use AI. They're saying most companies actually just don't have the maturity, the skills, and the readiness to even deal with the complexities of machine learning upfront. First, just get their feet wet building a deterministic chatbot, and then plan to mature gradually towards using natural language processing. So I think the situation we're in today is one of, it's kind of like getting into the elevator and to go up to the 100th floor and, ding, we've arrived at the second floor. That's kind of where we're at in terms of natural language processing. But it doesn't mean there isn't a 100th floor. It's way up there. Or you could call it the, journey of 1,000 leagues begins with a single step, or whatever metaphor you prefer. But it's very, very early in terms of maturity. But I am bullish about the long-term potential that is going to involve, integration between interactions with humans and interactions with AIs, and the blending of those modalities. I think it's going to be really exciting.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on iTunes, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.